What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, and today we are talking about, well, really just a discussion about the future of CRPGs as a whole, but moreover and more specifically, whether or not they'll die out again like they did kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was actually recently asked in a comment about exactly this, what I thought would actually happen with the genre as a whole, and while it would be real easy for me to just be like, yeah, I think it'll be fine, I actually have a surprising amount to say about this as I thought about it more and more. So that said, to give a short, snappy answer, no, I don't think CRPGs are going to die out the way they did in that particular time frame again in the future. Now, that comes with a couple caveats. One, I'm going to talk about the circumstances surrounding the kind of death of the genre right there and its resurgence. But moreover, towards the end, and once I get done with that part, I'll talk more about why I don't think that's going to happen again, frankly. So just to kind of jump into what caused that to happen in the first place. If you are unaware, the genre of CRPGs just kind of died, like late 90s, early 2000s. Now, this is for a variety of reasons. Poorly selling games, for starters, the kind of advent, if you will, of kind of 3D graphics really kind of coming into the scene in full force. Those are probably the two biggest factors. And each of those has a few things going on for it. So the poorly selling games, at the end of the day, a lot of the CRPGs from the 90s are real similar. Like, if you go back and look at most of the CRPGs from that area, none of them were really like mixing up the game back then. It was kind of like what battle royales are now. They're all more or less the same thing. And because of that, I think it wound up hurting sales, because at the end of the day, you can only play so many of that type of game before you're just like, well, that's that kind of game, and that's pretty much it. And sure, you're going to have those people who attach themselves to one franchise more than the next, like look what happened to Fallout, for instance. But nonetheless, it's hard to attract new people when you just keep doing the same thing. And the other thing I mentioned there was the advent of 3D graphics. So a lot of developers at this time wanted to do the big new thing, which was 3D graphics. And at the time, CRPGs were really more of like 2D hand-drawn backgrounds with sprites moving across the top. Like, that's how it worked on a technical level, which is a bit of a simplification, obviously, but you get the gist. And kind of because, in my opinion, a combination of those things, developers and publishers just started moving away from the genre. And outside of a few, like, seldom cases here and there, the genre just, by and large, just died. However, it made a bit of a comeback in the early 2010s, as most people are aware of at this point. And this was largely done thanks to games like Pillars of Eternity and Divinity Original Sin. These games, while they are not the first by any means, I always mention those two specifically because you have to understand, while they are not the first like revamped CRPGs to hit the scene, they're really not. The reason I always mention those two specifically is because those were the two games that hit like box office levels of success, so to speak, and kind of gave CRPGs this huge audience that I don't think they would have had otherwise. Because if you asked in the early 2010s, like just any old kid in high school, what a CRPG even was, I honestly don't know how many of them could have even answered that question. But then you have games like Pillars of Eternity and Divinity Original Sin hit the scene, and they managed to reinvigorate that genre in a way that is accessible not just to people who love said genre, but to new people as well. So those two kind of genres, made by companies who actually had a lot of experience doing some of the CRPGs from the era in which they died, actually making these new ones, and using that expertise to actually utilize new technology to make them more 3D, just across the board better looking, as well as more complex in terms of like choice and consequence, for instance, that simply the larger budgets of Kickstarter and things allowed them to do. And I think that was like the spark of the resurgence that then became this broader genre that's honestly just getting more and more attention all the time that I really love to see. Which brings me to the now, more or less, and the future going forward. While I do think CRPGs have a potentially bright future, reality is I do think there is a chance that they might fall off again. Why do I say that? Well, I play a ton of CRPGs, as anybody who watches this channel regularly knows. And I often quote a couple problems with CRPGs just across the board as a genre, but none are more probably prevalent than the simple fact that CRPGs are often based on complicated rule sets that their games fail to explore in any great depth, like tutorial-wise. They don't often like to explain themselves, and you then have to go to an outside source to find it. And from just a design standpoint, I don't think that can continue. Now, what I want to make very clear here is I don't want those systems to be dumbed down. I don't. I love Pathfinder's ridiculously complicated system and all of its ridiculously over-the-top classes that borderline on the point of superfluous. So I do not want slimmed-down versions of these games by any means, but I think these games as a whole need to do a better job of explaining themselves. And luckily, a few games are at least seeming to finally get that hint and try to address this through things like better tutorials and explaining these systems. And to put it very bluntly, I think if the genre as a whole wants to survive, that is something that has to happen. Now, beyond that, truthfully, I think we've got another 5 or 6 years of genuinely great CRPGs before we start to see a bit of a fall off. Because reality is, with any genre, you kind of see ups and downs, and CRPGs have been on a bit of a high here the past couple of years, and with a few amazing games on the way, I think that honestly we're in a bit of a really peak period for CRPGs. Now, this part is just pure speculation. I have absolutely no idea what might happen. The genre might blow up even farther for all I know, but my point is that these things tend to have hills and valleys, and we've been on a hill for a long time, so I'm really concerned that we'll get to a point where they're just like, here's another CRPG, and people's reactions will be like what you think now when you see a battle royale get released. It's like, oh, great, awesome, another one. And there's just that level of like, yeah, it's probably good, but also I'm just not interested because there's like 20 of them already. So I'm afraid we might see something like that happen in the future. But the optimist in me tells me that honestly, if CRPGs can just keep pushing their mechanics and things forward, like keep pushing what they can do with the technology in that format, which truthfully, a lot of them have been doing very well. If you look at games like Wasteland 3 or any of the more recent ones, CRPGs are getting very impressive visually and mechanically, even with what's going on behind the scenes to make combat feel smoother and stuff, even when it's turn-based. So I think if they can continue to advance that part of it while simultaneously learning to explain their systems better without dumbing those systems down and still giving people all of that depth to discover, I think it will continue to draw in more people who will fall in love with the genre the way I did and the way so many of the people probably watching this channel have, which is what I truly hope happens. There you go, guys. There is my thoughts about the future of the CRPG genre just across the board. It's a genre very near and dear to my own heart, so I honestly just love to talk about it and just see what it could become. Nonetheless, guys, thank you truly for watching. Could not be doing this stuff without you guys, so thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.